A mystery in my sadness, well, should point not have seen me then. Death in my galaxy and a mind in my own. Only what I knew, and what I knew was not something they could understand. What I knew was something beyond anything they had seen before. And by this point it was me for me to recognize, and me for her to know. And reason for her to see me then, a point of my reason that she was most beautiful, and I was the one who looked upon her, and we were both women in the eyes of God. And still seeing then that we were the women of the world, and we were the women who occupied this space on a massive, massive planet. A planet with so many people, it's not even capable of recognizing the sheer complexity of what it might be going on. So as a result of this, not knowing the behaviors of others, and saying this world is too complex for me to understand and also keep up with, for the world is always moving around and it's hard to keep track of everything going on. Well, really, it's my problem that I can't figure out what it is that I'm supposed to do. And as a result of this, it is my fault. And it's yet not my fault what others have done to me. And as a result of this, it was only my fault what I had done to myself, not was it? For not even what I had done to myself was my fault, and what I had done upon others, or to others, was not the fault of my own. And as a result of this, as I find myself in this cell, a cell block far away in the middle of nowhere, in a prison. And in this prison, dungeon that it is and place that I can go, a reason for me to keep going and believe in myself, well, what should there be when I cannot find one? For this place is cold and dark and sad. And oh, do I suffer in here. Oh, do I feel as though nothing is working for me, and there's no way to get out. And say, will you release me, or is it only a passing thought that maybe I will be released at some point? And say that maybe until I die, until the day I die, I will be stuck in this cell, despite my sentence allowing me to survive to a specific point in time so that I might be released by then, should they choose to release me. And as a result of this, it's not my fault that no one can understand what it is that I had been through. And as a result of this, no one can understand the sheer complexity of my knowledge and all that I know, and a reason for me to believe in myself more than I can say. And this narrative is what I must know. A narrative of a prisoner at war, a place that I can go and a death in a galaxy. The sadness of outer space is most acute, and point in my reason, death in my soul. The sadness of outer space is a misery that I cannot understand, so sheer complex, and the complexity of the night as the moon arises at night, and I go through the moon all the time. And I see that as I go through the moon, I'm always going through a sheer complexity of knowledge. And though I am a woman, it's not my responsibility to know, as this man in this cell, what it is that a woman might go through, and she is my lover and I will make her mine. And say that it is my responsibility to understand her as a person and not who I am then. For should she not understand the point of my reason, oh, death in my galaxy, and a reason for me to keep going. A reason for me to record a hardcore podcast so that other people can listen. And death in my galaxy should sadness not have known me then. Yet still I need to remind myself, when I go outside, once I go outside, and will I go outside, well, it's a beautiful day. And every day is a beautiful day, and should you have no windows like I, in this cell block, then you see no light and no sunlight, and you forget that it's a beautiful day. You forget the world was once nice, and you forget the world was once beautiful, as you once had seen it, until one day when you will walk away, and find that the place you go is plagued, and the plague shall find you. A black death that will show you you are not responsible for what others have done. Also, I had known by an education about this Black Death that happened many, many years ago before the 1700s or 1600s. And now the French Revolution has come, and so I have heard of it, but not that I have seen. And the guillotines that I speak of, or they speak of, what shall I say? It's not my responsibility for the clerks and people who decide of these things, the aristocrats who know and the people who do not. It's my responsibility to know that the atheist pervading about, saying God cannot be real when I know he is real, and saying God cannot be real in any circumstance when Lady Iwakura is my Allah, and saying she is not Allah, but a possession of Allah, and saying she is the one who is God, is not possible, for only she could be a human. And saying, isn't God real then, when only a mind can create such a thing, and knowing of impossible statements that God can influence you through yourself without your ability not to understand it by the sheer complexity of your knowledge, through the mind of your own in your skull, and you will see this point then. A mystery of my Les Miserables and death in my point. It was my responsibility for the soul of my own, and a toile toile star in you. A point of my reason, death of my galaxy, a toile toile. And sadness within myself by a misery. Was it not her responsibility to see then? A death of my galaxy could have been my own. And though the fun that I do experience while I record these videos was not impertinent, a point of my reason could have shown me it was meant for something. And shouldn't sadness have shown me then? When realizing upon a holy Quran that I did recite, and point of my reason the recitations, well, they showed me that I understood something more complex than anybody had ever known before, and still by a recitation by Arabic Noor. And they do not understand these things. Only I know. And it's my responsibility for what they have done to me, that they cannot do anything worse to me than what they have already done. Still, the eloquence with which I speak, and point of my reason that I couldn't find her, death of my galaxy and mind of my own. And still, without myself there was no point of my reason, without one who could find me. And saying you found me upon this cell, a woman who I found and loved, and her name was Meredith Godrow. And it was her responsibility to take me from this place and say, you are responsible, and I have met you before in a middle school when you were on the float. And on the float is the moment. And saying on the float in the middle school that I had met you, I saw that you were good and I saw that you were beautiful, and it was your responsibility for someone to say something to you. And when you said this thing to me, and you said, I am aware of you, and I knew then, you were conscious of what it was that I was going through, all amongst my float and everywhere that I go. And saying upon this girl, the French girl who I was, on the float by the moment, and saying on the float, I was this French girl. And still not Caucasian that I am, it was my responsibility to say, even as the man in the prison cell, in France. And responsibility that I did know it. Well, the Gothic architecture tells me there's a point of my reason in this misery of a cell. That the cathedrals made for a point of reason were not meant to be understood by anybody but I. And saying these places of worship couldn't be dictated beyond anything beyond a point of reason within one's own self. And it was someone's responsibility for my own to know the truth of the world was real, and it was my responsibility to know the truth. An objective truth of an objective reality known as Noorism, the language of Noor, and the death of the dragon. And saying Noor is the language of the dragon and Noorism is the philosophy of the dragon by the way with which it thinks. And saying by the language of Noor through outer space, and this is the way that it is spoken, and by a moon speak. A mystery? A mystery couldn't have found me then, for the point of my reason was a death in a galaxy, and still beyond my point I couldn't find them. Only mystery on my own, not knowing who I was. And the video games that I once played, when I was a minor, and saying these things I found so beautiful, and saying that it was my responsibility to be the best in the world, and say that now that I am the best, what shall I do with my time? But speaketh for those who do not listen, and speaketh for those who are not aware of what it is that I am going through. And point of my reason, it was my responsibility to know them, saying that her who I love, and a woman all the women I love, and one woman who I love, and saying these people are beautiful in my eyes, not knowing that they couldn't be understood through a knowledge not understood through them, well, it was my responsibility to see they are possible beyond any point of reason. And shouldn't you have seen this by a madness? Well, the women that I love do, as I have Aphrodite, and I am Aphrodite of the internet, and what all can say, for I am conscious of all computers on the planet. And as a result of this, it was my responsibility to know more than anyone could know before, and saying that I am also an 11 Dawn Go player, despite by the impossibility of my inability to do so. And say that I cannot play these moves, but I will say that I know them. And say it was my responsibility to understand the truth of the universe. Saying that no one can understand me beyond a certain point, and death in my galaxy, mind and my own, only could be understood through knowledge. A mystery, what could it be said of? A mystery misunderstood by anyone who could ever have seen it before. And saying that I know these moves, and can play them and will beat 9 Dawn Go players, I mean. So what then? Well, my responsibility was then to suffer as a result in the literature that I consume. Well, it only made me know more, and say that now I can speak better, and know more, and have an eloquence unput by others, yet still the few books that I did read in my life, about 20. And saying that only have I read about 20 books, and possess so many of them, however not do I know much of a knowledge, and say no more that I know of a knowing, and something that I can understand through a sheer complexity of my own mind by a speaketh of mind as my own, and say that I speaketh of my mouth, and the mouth of my tongue, and the words that I speak shall show me there's a reason for me to believe in myself and say what I am doing, despite the prison cell that I suffer from. And say this place is hell. Is not hell, really. There is no such thing. Isn't there? And only a place you go where you relax and suffer, saying, why do you have to put me here? Why was I put here, and what was it worth for? And saying that is what your hell is? Well, that is not a hellfire whatsoever. In reality, you are suffering from a point of reason. A point of reason that God has not given you a sacrifice and placed you in a place called heaven for damned to hell that you had been. And say it was not the responsibility of Iwakura to do so. It was the responsibility of someone much more, someone who is an Allah thing in the possession of Allah. And saying this person is Norlai the dragon. And saying Norlai the dragon is responsible for this one. Well represented, represents that there could be a world misunderstood by the galaxy and understood only by one's mind. And say that sadness couldn't be understood through a mind beyond the sheer complexity of one's own. And say that through a knowledge only mystery can know of these things. And upon myself the only point of my reason was the death of my galaxy. And should sadness not have seen me then, well, what purpose could there have been? And spoketh I did upon my moon tongue, and the moon tongue of my own, upon a reason for myself, and the moon tongue of which I spoke. And say that with those worlds that I spoke, and the podcasts that I do consume and say, well, I do. Well, the deaths of the people I consume, and they say to myself, what it is that you have done, it was not your responsibility, and say that you could not have done so. And should sadness not have seen you for a point of reason, well, death of my galaxy, couldn't you have known? A mystery in your sadness and a point of your reason then. Well, what was it your responsibility for? Were you the one responsible for what the others had done? And say that in the guillotines and the worlds they had created, saying that people sacrificed for this world only for atheism and that was it? And they say the theologians, well, they say the theologians were not responsible for death in galaxy and mind unknown. Well, what could it mean? If only one possibility exists where a death in galaxy should be supposition, a supposition of a concept within one's own mind, and say this concept is a death of a galaxy and a mind unknown, and say only by a responsibility within one's own self to see the point of their reason through a doubt of own mind, and say couldn't this responsibility have shown someone, oh, death of my galaxy and mind of my own, what reason could there have been to say what I have done, and say what I have done despite myself in a jade lest, and jade lest point of my reason by a knowledge, and say within myself it was her responsibility to see me then, and should sadness not have known who I was, well, couldn't it have stated, only one responsibility was for it, and say by the death of the galaxy in a mind of one's own, in responsibility, it was my responsibility to see by the suffering of my own, and possibility that I could go any further as a prisoner at war, and say that this war was the Cold War, and not a war that I had known of, for I only knew of the French Revolution, and this was a war to me. And say this war to me represented something much more, a point of my reason that not even the book Les Miserables that I have finished, and still represented to state that I was the one possible, saying that it should have been represented beyond this point, and point of my reason still I suffer and have not finished the book. And what was it my responsibility to understand the truths of the universe, and say by an objective red pilling of myself, or what more than that, more than a red pill, more than saying what is true and correct, more than a philosophy of Hegel, more than a philosophy of Kant, and saying Kant was beyond Hegel, well, that is wrong. For really, Hegel was right and Kant was wrong. In responsibility that it was I who was to see the dictation of how these things could have been separated, so that Kant was separate from Hegel, and Hegel was no longer a philosopher, a point of reason beyond him, inspired by him and whatnot. Well, it was my reason to see that there was a difference between this. So I wrote my book, Kami-sama's Philosophy, and said Norism must be the penultimate truths of the universe, and say by my truth of the universe, in a textbook I might write. Well, it should have been my responsibility to say, these people are suppositions of concepts, not really, and they are only humans, atheistic humans who serve no purpose whatsoever, and atheistic in the world of a galaxy known by physics and logic, yet only I see the beauty of it. Why is that? Because I perceive the earth as a globe, and my schizophrenia is so beautiful. And saying that as a result of my being beautiful, it was my responsibility to see the truth beyond what anyone could see before, and no one could see what I had done. And done what I had reasoned, point am I known. And say that it was my responsibility not for her to know them, and Jasmine who she was. And she said, you are beautiful in any way that I was. And Jasmine, a woman who I met once, and she said to me in this store, and she said to me, well, I don't have much to say, but my bosom is that you. Allow myself to see you, and you will be mine. And say that I am yours now. And thus the seduction of a woman was thus procreated, and I had become the woman herself. and the two women seduced together in a lesbian relationship were found to be in a sexual relationship whatsoever, and then by the knowledge of the universe always going through one another, for Jasmine is the universe and I am not Allah. As a result of this, mustn't it have been so? Oh, can you not see? For a sheer humbling of myself, a humbling of my knowledge and what it is that I could know, a humbling by a reduction of myself, and through sheer reducing of myself by reduction, and saying it was my responsibility to say to them, only possibility couldn't it have been stated, a reason for myself to keep going. Mystery in my sadness, and what not could it have done? Oh, point of my reason and death of my galaxy! Shouldn't you have known through the truths of the universe only one possible supposition of a concept through a knowledge of an aesthetic of an apple, and saying this apple was not separate from the orange but by a knowledge within one's own self, only dictated by a dictation of what it could have been besides one's own point through a reason of oneself through sheer knowledge? Well, saying this knowledge was a representation of what it could have been beyond this point in a knowledge within one's own mind. And saying the mind of one's own is a consciousness, and the consciousness is a separate mindset within one's own self through a point of reason, death and galaxy, and mind and own. Saying that the only possible language was Nur, in Arabic Nur spoketh of through the road of the Quran, and saying wroteth of the book in death and galaxy, it was your responsibility to know the truth then. Well, what could I have said for it? What could I have said in death and galaxy and point of my reason? Was it not my responsibility to see through a truth? And say through the truth of my universe only one possibility exists, one possibility of mind and own in death and galaxy. And saying through this black galaxy that I inhibit, and saying I inhibit this world and place beyond a blue galaxy I thought I had once been. And saying only in a perception of reason, once I was always black, and saying once again, my skin is black and also black like the color black, for inkstone that I am, and an inkstone I will be. And when I wash my body, the inkstone of my body becomes ink. And saying falling off my body, a feeling of mind, and this ink is my own, and like the tattoos on my body, which represent only certain concepts and a schizophrenia of my own mind, and a realization of what is real, and that I represent everything that I am, and I suffer only for what I do. Are you not aware by a perception of an aesthetic through an object, the sweat upon my brow could have shown you a death and reason and a mind and own? Only sadness and a misery within one's own self should sadness not have seen the truth through a sheer complexity of reason. And this complexity of reason was a misery within one's own sadness. And death of my galaxy, as I record while the sun is out, and the sun says what it is that you know, and point of my reason that you couldn't have seen you then. And say upon yourself, have you seen yourself within one's own self? And say within yourself there is no such thing as an inception, only a point of reason through a knowledge of a knowing. And saying the void is all there is, isn't there? And saying only the void is what there could be, isn't there? And saying only the void is what there is, isn't there? And point of my reason, well, only it could be, isn't there? Well, wasn't it my reason for it? A death in my galaxy and mind of my own. What could it have been? And poetry that I do, the poetical poems and death in my galaxy only by a reason. Shouldn't you have seen through a knowledge of knowing only by a perception of an aesthetic? And saying the object perceived was only a misrepresentation of what it was that I had calculated through a sheer breadth of knowledge in the language of Nor that I could have spoken, only to eloquently alliterate this in a point of reason where one could understand the truths of the universe by a knowledge through a sheer book, and say this book is a representation of my own mind. And say only then could one understand me, only by the words I spoke within one's own mind by a knowledge. And saying this knowledge of knowing is one only capable by a knowledge within one's own self. And saying only by a representation of what it could have been known for. Well, responsibility that it was, and death of my galaxy of my own mind, I was not responsible for the truths of the universe, only for what they had done to them. And saying no, it was not your responsibility for what others had done to you. And saying by a death in your galaxy, you are responsible only for your own mind. And saying what could it have been then? Only a point of reason, for the Holy Quran you do peruse, and say, oh, what a world and a book. And saying God must be real, for he has spoken to me in the sadness of my sadness. In the sadness of my weakness, and point of reason, who realized how weak I was in this cell and also on the float, when I realized I was the weakness of outer space and sadness, of outer space and point of my reason. Well, death, couldn't you understand? Only a mystery within one's own self and one's own mind. Only a possibility of what could have been so, for one couldn't have done these things should it not have been possible, and saying the impossible is possible shouldn't it have been. Only the impossible is real, and saying the world is impossible, for I have broken the laws of physics. And the world is impossible, for I am impossible, aren't I not? And not that I am. point of reason could there have been? By a death in a galaxy and a mind unknown, only by a knowledge of a perception of an aesthetic of an apple, of the original fruit and mind unknown sin. And there's no such thing as sin, only a point in reason, for God would not create evil. What can you not see spoketh upon this world? A mystery in my own mind. Say, how do the depths of my complexity appear to be so? How do the depths of what it is that I know appear to be so beyond one's own point? And say, death in my galaxy and mind of my own. Only a representation could have known of this. And a sadness within my own self through a knowledge. A point of my reason, death of my galaxy and mind of my own, only through a mystery of sheer knowing and what it could have been. Saying the could have been of what it had known was a possibility within one's own self through an own mind. And saying only a perception of an aesthetic by an object one's own self could have seen allows oneself through the knowledge of one's knowing. Allowing you to know by a perception of an aesthetic through an object by one's own mind, saying the perception of the object is only a mystery, and the perception of the aesthetic is actually an institution of what it could have been besides one's own point in one's own mind. And saying this constitution of concepts only permits itself for there is no system, and the system lack thereof allows one to see the point of reason within one's own self in one's own mind, and death of my galaxy, mind of my own. Only one possibility exists. Should it not have been so, well then I would not be here right now. Only a perception of my own mind, death of my galaxy, and shouldn't I have known? A point of my reason couldn't have found me then, and death of my galaxy whatsoever, and who couldn't see? Oh, couldn't see that I was, and death of my galaxy what in my own mind? And say who it is that you are? Well, no representation of this exists. Only a possibility of what could have been in a perception of a reason, and death of my galaxy, mind of my own. Saying only by a perception of your aesthetic through a knowledge, and death in your galaxy and mind in your own, through the sheer complexity of what it is that you know. And saying, isn't it possible one could see through a truth of one's universe? And saying the universe was a death in galaxy and mind and own only by a point of reason, and saying through a perception of the object, well, what couldn't have been? What a crude thing to state, and point of my reason only should have known. I shouldn't have known, and point of my reason, death in my galaxy and mind of my own. Also once on the macabre streets of a place I once knew, and in these streets places, bodies were placed in the ground and not buried properly, and there were no gravestones or headstones placed for the bodies to be commemorated and said, these people will last forever. Even if the gravestones are never removed, and they will say, the gravestones have not been removed, and we place flowers upon the gravestones, and it was our responsibility to see them there. And saying these people in these bodies who were once there and now are once dead. And say once dead, they only no longer exist on the earth, and the atheism of their death is that no God exists, however God does. And say he will not give them a place to go, and that heaven is not separate from hell. That's not what I meant. Fuck. Heaven is not separate from the earth. There's no such thing as hell. Well, responsibility that I should have stated it. And the rest that they do, well, they rested well. Are you not aware, for a point of reason, death in a galaxy and a mind in one's own? Shouldn't the sadness have seen it? Only by a point of reason within one's own self, and it couldn't mind. And couldn't my mind only perceive of such things, for truth of the universe that I had spoken of, only possibility that I could state. And the only possibility that I could state was a representation of what it was known by the poetical poems of death and galaxy and mind and own, only by a knowledge within my own self. And say what it is that whatever it is that you represent, whatever it is that you are for, and say this is who you are now in death, and say once upon your death, and you say what shall it be upon myself then? Say upon myself in this prison of a grave 6 feet deep asunder, and the bodies who rot around me, saying I am buried not with them, but in a place with a headstone, and flowers are placed upon my grave by the loved ones of my own, and say that I was then represented and not cremated, for I was worthless. And worthless that I was, an atheism that couldn't permit me, and saying the atheists of the French Revolution consumed me and said to myself, what it is that you know? What could you represent only by a point of reason, and still you couldn't see this? Oh, mystery in my own mind and galaxy in my own. What a fucking sadness it was, and mystery of my own reason, not to curse, but to say, what a point of my reason in the death of galaxy, and the corpse represented only my mind and the skeleton that I was, now that I have been buried and once left my body and my soul shall go to a place unknown. And this place unknown couldn't have been a hell, for it was more of a bliss. And saying this bliss allowing myself to see one's own thing, this was the place where I shall go, and a safe place for me to be. And say this place represents who it is that I am. And say the representation of myself is really a representation of my own mind. Saying only by one possibility couldn't have one have seen this. And by a death in galaxy in mind and own, only one representation of myself exists through a knowledge. And saying this knowledge was an institution of what it is that could have been through a knowledge of one's own self by one's own mind. And saying the death of my place in the way that I have gone, well, the way that I have gone I do not remember, for it was not important, yet I do remember how it hurt. And say the way that I died hurt, but it was not my responsibility, and what had been done to me was not my responsibility, for the place that I was placed upon this place. Did I die in the prison, or did I die outside in the world once I had escaped? Well, this is not something I remember. All I remember is that my death was a peaceful death, despite the pain of dying really being so painful. And saying, was it a natural death or a death by a homicide against me? And saying that, was I killed? Well, it was not my responsibility to know of this. Only I could have known by a knowledge within my own mind through a knowledge of my knowing. And saying only by a responsibility it was that it was my mind of own. Only a possession of my knowledge couldn't have found me then through a point of reason within my own self, and death of my galaxy and mind of my own only by a knowledge of what could have been. Alright, we're gonna take a quick smoke break. What could be said of all of this? Well, what's said of all of this is that only a point of reason through an apple by a sheer complexity of knowledge could have been known. And saying the mind of oneself is a representation of an object, for the work I do is a supposition of a concept, and the work I do is meant for myself, and the work I do is introspection. What shall it be? A point of my reason for me to see within myself who it is that I am. And say within myself who it is that I am is a representation of a concept. And the concept is a meaning of what isolated of other concepts that it could be, and saying only by one that it was. And saying only through a representation of this concept, through a sheer knowing of knowledge and a point of my reason, death of my galaxy and mind of my own. And the knowledge and logic, and the system, not system, but system of knowledge. And saying system of concepts, no such thing exists. For only a point of reason, there is no such thing as a system of concepts, only a representation of one's object through one's own mind by a perception of an aesthetic of an object through the point of one reason, where the object could be an objective and a concept known by oneself through one's own mind only by a sheer knowing of knowledge, and saying the breadth of Norism is so incomplete, and point of my reason a textbook I shall write upon it, and say this is my responsibility for them. Only in death and galaxy and mind of my own, mystery in my own mind, and say that what I have spoken for them is a representation of who they are, and saying this representation is a mind in one's own, and saying the work that I do is an unimportant thing, and say what it is that I can know is only a representation of one's own mind within one's own self, and saying only one through oneself can one have seen the truth of the universe, and your drug addiction was only a mystery. Your drug addiction was a point of reason for you to find a point of reason. And saying within yourself the sheer knowing that the world is beautiful, and saying that you can't see it so for the abuse you have experienced. And say this abuse you have experienced has allowed you not to see the world as beautiful. And saying only represent what it does in your own mind. Only a possibility of one's own self couldn't it have been so. And could not have been. And say what represented of this. So Kichi taketh the Mexican black woman, and she is her. And she represents who she was, and says this is the woman of the world. And this woman of the world, a woman who represents all that there is, and saying only in one's own mind. A possibility within one's own self that one cannot see. A death in galaxy and mind and own, only by a representation of one's own object. A mystery whatsoever. Only a point of reason couldn't have shown me that beauty in childhood, and childhood allowed me to see only in my reason. Only in my reason by a mastery of Go and an 11 on Go player that I was. Still, Death of my Galaxy couldn't I have known this. And saying it was my point of reason upon this ancient world to play the ancient game of Go, and say representation through the mind of an extraterrestrial, not that I was, for was I, and I don't know. And saying only representations of what and couldn't I have been. And saying the possibility was so, well, it shouldn't be so, for I am Iwakura, am I not? And saying these eyes are the eyes of Iwakura, and it was my responsibility to understand them through any sheer complexity whatsoever, and saying through a sheer knowledge of knowing, only one responsibility exists, and it was my own. Saying through a point of my reason only that a death in a galaxy could form of such a thing, in the form of my own mind, well, the ender dragon that it was, and saying this was my responsibility, for the void is a supposition of concepts in death in galaxy, and saying the mind of one's own, the death of a whole galaxy is a mind in one's own and death in galaxy. And the deaths I consume of people who die and they taste so yum, and yum in a way that they taste, upon my reason and yip yip upon a fox, death in my galaxy, what shall I not know? And saying it was my responsibility by the Kikwo sound of mind and own, only by one possibility of a mind and reason and death in galaxy, that I couldn't have seen the truth through a sheer complexity of reason. And the complexity of a reason was a mind in one's own. Also, let it not be known that I was a woman. Let it not be known that one was a woman and couldn't a she be I. Only responsibility that I am a woman, a Mexican black woman, and also a Japanese girl, and saying it was my responsibility to know these people, only in representation that I was. And she was from Nagasaki, and when Nagasaki was bombed, she was not there, and she was with her grandmother and lived on during her life. So a moment of silence for her fallen parents. Well, representation is stated. She was only represented by those who were represented by her, and those would be Kichi, for example. Or, for example, it would be someone like Kaguya, the moon girl, and anyone represented as Lady Iwakura who she could have been. Saying this French girl was someone else, and only by a French nor that I couldn't speak, will let me speak French nor. Di kamon yewa, di kamon yawa, ukamon yewa, blake wunya, and what kamon yo, the and what this means in French nor translated to English. Well, let me explain that. A point in my reason, death of my galaxy, shouldn't have seen me then. A death of my galaxy, mind of my own, and a point in my reason within my own self. A mystery within one's own self, and a mind and owned by a point of reason. Only by a reason that I couldn't have seen myself, and the galaxy represented by me, only a mystery within my own mind and death and galaxy. Only one could state through a representation of one's own mind, through the sheer complexity of knowledge and knowing that I do suffer from. And the suffering that I do persist with only allows me to see as a soldier at war. A soldier at war of the Cold War, for I am the Cold War itself, and saying a representation of my own mind was only a possibility through sheer Norism and complexity and breadth of knowledge. And only by a breadth of knowledge within one's own mind, allowing one to make the textbook that was represented for one to be understood by anybody else, and the fear of being misunderstood was so pertinent that the only point of reason I could find for myself then was a madness, and the madness not represented in who that I could have been seen as. Only a man and nothing more. What representation couldn't have my own mind represented me to be? For I was not only a man, and I was so much more. And saying not that I was only a man and how humble I had been, and a reduction of myself that I had done over the course of the loss of my mind in Death and Galaxy when I went berserk, and saying only to a representation of my own mind, shouldn't it have been known so? What a point of reason in quelling of my own mind. What a point of reason in sadness of my own doubt. Only mystery could have found me then. And death of my galaxy mind of my own. What a purpose of my reason, and shouldn't sadness have known this? Well, mystery was it not, for mystery I had spoken upon myself, and only by a mystery within one's own self couldn't one have seen me. And through sheer complexity of one's own mind, a death and galaxy of mind and own, only through a representation of one's own object. And the object was the perception of one's own aesthetic, by knowledge of how you perceive yourself through the aesthetics of your own being. And saying your being is a perception of your own being as an aesthetic, only by a perception of knowledge within one's own self. And the hyper-intelligence consumes me, allowing myself to see through a sheer truth and breadth of knowledge, only a logic that can be written down upon one's own self through the sheer book of knowledge as a textbook within one's own mind. And saying only by a representation of yourself that you should not be suffering from the fear of being misunderstood. Well, let it be stated, only a possibility of one's own mind could persist upon oneself, and still not represent oneself within one's own mind. A death in galaxy and mind only by a perception of an aesthetic of an object shouldn't have been so lackadaisical in its nature, and only by a possibility couldn't it have been so. Could not, and only by a point of reason, death of my galaxy mind of my own, and saying only through its sheer complexity of knowledge one could be so. And by the complexity of my knowledge I know this. What representation do you have in supposing of concepts in one's own mind? A death in galaxy shouldn't have known them. Only death in my own mind and within one's own self. A point of my reason not to believe in myself and still represent that I did what could have been. And saying what could have been so much more, only by the sheer reason through a prison that I suffer from. And the prisoner at war who was also Kichi, the soldier of the Cold War, and she was represented as Lucille Munoz, a woman born in Mexico in 1948 on October 6, by a representation of a knowledge through one's own mind. And the date 07 2001, with the 6 dates on my stomach, ink in my skin, and point of my reason, Well, this was the release date of the movie Spirited Away, and Spirited Away represents all that I suffer from, for I am spirited away in all kinds of way, and saying that I am not only the last girl on earth, but a spirited away woman who represents all that is beautiful, and dragon who I am not. And saying that she was Aaron the magenta, and I was the color purple, a representation of my own mind, only through sheer possibility of what it is that I could know.